Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 3 of season 2 of Stories of Learning, where we dive into the learning process and talk to guests about their experiences and their approaches to learning in all different types of fields. Usually we take most of the segments from Josh Waitzkin's book, The Art of Learning, so definitely check that out, and I'll leave a link in the description. But today I'm really excited to be joined by Jeremy Dion. I discovered Jeremy's book, The Art of Mindful Singing, Notes on Finding Your Voice, about 2 years ago, and I was really excited to try and get him on the show. So I won't go into too much detail. I'll let him explain what the book's about and what he has to say. So enjoy. Well, thanks so much for being a part of this with me.
You bet. Yeah, I'm excited to do it. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, I discovered your book probably a couple of years ago from one of the other vocalists at our music school that I teach at. Found it at the local store and dove into it myself.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'm sure we'll talk more about it as we go on, but I have 3 segments usually that I get into with everybody. But before we dive into that, I was hoping that we could hear a little bit about who you are and what you do and what you're up to.
Great. Yeah, so my name is Jeremy Dion. I live in Colorado in the USA. And I do a couple different things. The majority of my time work-wise, so I'm a therapist. I'm a trained psychotherapist, and I work a lot in pediatric settings. So I'm primarily in private practice, and I've got an office where I'm working a lot with younger kids and teenagers, and many of them are as young as 4 and 5, but probably the majority of my clients are like between the ages of 8 and 18. And they're seeing me for a whole variety of different reasons, right? The typical components these days, because most of them are students, has to do oftentimes with high anxiety and stress management, sometimes getting into trouble with substance-related disorders, or and then the generic components that most of us are dealing with in terms of our family relationships and dynamics and just trying to be healthier. And so I end up doing a lot of play therapy, where I'm working in a sandbox or using board games. Part of my graduate work, as I was working towards becoming a therapist, was also in music therapy, and so I've done a lot of work using different instruments, primarily percussion instruments, but some stringed instruments as well. And sometimes I use those in a small group setting. Other times I might do a more hands-on sort of a songwriting actually approach, which are working with certain kids. Yeah. So I do a lot of therapy. I'm in a private practice. I also do some school counseling in Boulder, Colorado, which is the town right next door to us. And then in my own time, I write a lot of music, and I'm a singer-songwriter and a performing artist. And that my energy for that and the time that I carve out for that certainly waxes and wanes. And there was a time when I was performing 4 or 5 times a month, and then there's been other times when I've been performing 4 to 5 times a year. And so it just, depending on kind of what other things are going on. I also have a 13-year-old daughter, so that takes precedence over a lot of things. And but that's how I spend most of my time.
Awesome. Yeah. And you have the book that I was talking about as well.
And I have the book. Yeah, that was a really interesting way that came together. So for years, I've kind of had a sense that I wanted to write a book and kind of thought I would, but I never really had crystallized a vision as to what I thought that might be about. I had a writing friend who has written a book in this same series that then mine ended up being included in. So it's published in the UK primarily, and the series is by Quarto Press, and Leaping Hare Press is the publisher. And the theme that ties these different books together, about 25 of them now, all written by different authors, is mindfulness. So there's mindfulness and parenting, and mindfulness on the natural world, and baking, and raising chickens, and all these other things. And they kind of asked me, she had told them a little bit about me, and part of why I moved from the West Coast, I was born and raised near Seattle, and part of why I moved to Colorado nearly 20 years ago was to attend graduate school at a place called Naropa University in Boulder, which is a Buddhist-based, I went to the graduate program. So I spoke the sort of language of mindfulness and had some experience in different types of meditation. And so here this book series seemed to kind of be tailored for some of my major interests, already having some of those themes woven throughout. But my friend kind of put a bug in my ear and let me know they were looking for someone to write the one on mindfulness and singing, and would I be interested? And it seemed like just this outstanding opportunity, and it really kind of fell into my lap. And they had, of course, this existing series, so they had the artwork kind of done as I had already begun writing. I had never worked with editors before, but that was a really wonderful and humbling but transformational process.
Yeah.
And it was really great. And my favorite part since, it's been out in the world, I think, since 2017, is hearing from people, frankly, like you, Jordan, that are kind of from all over the world, from Scotland and Australia and other places, that have just sort of stumbled upon the book, which is called The Art of Mindful Singing. And that's been a real treat, an unexpected part of the journey for me.
Really cool. That's awesome. I'll definitely post a link for that in the show notes so that people can check it out if they have a minute. Cool. Well, then we can jump into the first section, which is called Beginner's Mind. All of my sections come from Josh Waitzkin's book, The Art of Learning, which is a really interesting book where he dives into his experiences in the learning process. So he was a chess master, or a high-level chess player, and then later on in life he switched to Tai Chi Chuan. So it's kind of his story about his pathway through that, and now he's kind of a learning strategist. So he talks with people about how to get the highest level performance that they can at a new or old skill that they're working on. So that's where I kind of frame a lot of my topics from his book. So at the beginning of his book, he talks about himself playing chess as a young kid. I think he's 7 or 8, and he describes how he just kind of dives into it just out of pure enjoyment. He's in the park playing with the other adults, and he just loves it. So a big part of the learning process for me, because I teach young guitarists and bassists and piano players and whatnot, and a big part of it for me is making sure that they enjoy it, that there's joy in it, and that they have fun. So how do you view that process of the learning when it comes to vocalists or mindfulness or anything in your kind of field?
Yeah, good questions. I think so much of what you're hitting on with the beginner's mind is critical to learning anything, and certainly something creative like music and singing and writing that inherently makes any of us feel just excessively vulnerable anytime we do it, right? Opening up our voices to sing is one thing, whether we're by ourselves in the car or in the kitchen, in the shower, but doing it in front of another human being is one of the more terrifying things I've ever done, and I consider myself a singer, right? And yet when I think back to my early days, or at least the stories that I hear of myself at 2 and 3 and 4 years old, like most kids, especially that like music, I was singing all the time and dancing all the time and not caring much at all about whether I hit the right note or whether I got the lyrics right or whether I did the dance move the right way. It was about what you're talking about, which is getting in touch with that creative, spontaneous space where joy comes from, and I think is naturally present. And so with music, and with singing in particular, I find it easier to connect with I'll talk about kids for a moment. I don't think adults are too different. I try to work very slowly towards the more vulnerable spaces incrementally. So, for example, I may start with a rhythm exercise that doesn't require anybody to use their vocal cords quite yet. We might pound on a simple drum or clapping or snapping or something. And I'll often start with a simple sort of like call and response, so that I set the structure and I'm the container, and there's a lot of safety in that for any of us, right? If someone else tells me what to do and I can naturally do that, I'm not risking too much, other than, I might mess up the rhythm or something, but it's different than where we sometimes go. So I'll try to create, it's almost sort of the therapeutic process as I'm reflecting on that with anybody, whether I'm using music with them or not, is that the first step that's required before being able to kind of move anywhere is rapport, right? Establishing a connection. And the only way that I find I'm able to do that, both as the learner and in many regards as the therapist, is if I'm grounded and present and open, and I put my phone down and I'm not thinking too much about the email I just received or the one I have to send next. And I use breath and breathing a lot throughout my work, both again as a human, as a therapist, but certainly when I'm working with people in musical arenas and just in my office in general, about using just even that one simple breath of coming back to this moment and staying with that beginning sense of that beginner's mind that allows us to cultivate sound for sound's sake, right? And getting out of the critical mind that wants to judge everything and categorize whether it sounded right or on, or whether someone's going to like it or not. And I would say too, one piece that I reflect on frequently because it's so in my face all the time have been the 13, almost now 14 years that I've been parenting, and watching those substantive differences, right? As my daughter, her name is Avery, would, early days, right, would scribble a drawing and call it great. And here I'm in my sort of more logical mind trying to, sort of quote unquote stay within the lines or make it look representative enough of that tree or whatever I was trying to do. But
Yeah.
those two endeavors come from such different places. And I find myself constantly trying to get back to that beginner's mind, those early developmental stages of doing the thing for the thing's sake, not because I wanted to make money with it or have it sound good or get a recording contract or all the other things that sometimes are motivating us but take us away from the real craft. The last piece I think I would add to that is that there's a certain sort of self-awareness that develops slowly that at times becomes real frustrating for me when I start to notice how judgmental my brain can get and how critical I get of my voice in particular or my guitar playing or the rhythm I just created, etc. And there's a softening that can happen. It's like a meditative process where, for example, if I'm in the middle of a mindfulness exercise and the goal is just to watch my breath, and every time I catch a thought that has bubbled up in the meantime, those are those magical moments, not to beat myself up that I became unpresent, but to say, I caught one, right? Here I am again, and returning again to that starting point of what it feels like to breathe. And I find that process, both as just even doing a short meditation, really dovetails nicely with the same sort of skill I want to bring and attention I want to bring to that critical part of our minds that starts to judge the voice, the sound, the learning that I'm doing, and whether it's happening quickly enough, whether all the different layers that we insulate ourselves with to, I think, become a little more comfortable at times. So anyway, there's a slow kind of dawning of awareness that I think happens over time of learning to recognize that critic, that inner judge that is with us, all the time if we're paying attention.
Yeah. That we tend to develop more as we get older, right? We try to get back to when we were young, and it was all for the fun of it.
Yeah, it sounds so easy, doesn't it? We watch kids and it is so easy. It's so natural. We're not designed to stay there, I guess, unfortunately. But the eternal fountain of youth quest, I think, is woven in with some of that.
Yeah. Well, that leads nicely into my second section, actually, which is the power of presence. So, like we've been talking about, there's a number of sections in your book that talks about that. But how do you feel that process of really being able to, I won't say make yourself present, but to just be present, how is that important for learning and especially learning something new?
I think two pieces. One, the short version is it's vital, right? We're not really going to learn anything unless we're present, and that's a lot of what I see with my students, etc. That through stress and anxiety we start zoning out because things get too hard or intense, and we miss the thing that then was just shared. Whether it was a new way to fret a chord on an instrument or learning the capitals of various countries, and I think the good news is that I find anyway, when learning something, if it can stay in sort of that sweet spot, right? There's this concept of the flow, and there's a Hungarian writer, psychologist actually, with a great name, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. I love that.
Nice.
And he wrote extensively and did a lot of research about these states of flow, and what he was talking about, and other people have built upon it certainly, is that If a task is too easy for us, we tend to zone out and kind of go on autopilot a bit. If it's too hard for us, we really get stuck and kind of self-defeated, and that inner critic can really rear his or her head and dominate this landscape. But if it can really find that sweet spot that finds the blend between the challenge of the task, but also my skill set and where I currently am in learning to sing that, to draw that, to play that, to meditate, whatever it is, then we can achieve, we can and kind of enter into these states of flow where we're working, we're learning, we're present, it's enjoyable and fun, and the time kind of just dissipates, right? We get kind of more right brain, which doesn't have a real linear sense of space and time, and those are those moments where we can lose ourselves for hours in whatever activity that was. So thankfully, on certain hands, I think obviously it's vital to be as present as possible when trying to learn something. On the other, I think keeping in mind what I just described about that flow paradigm, because if we find ourselves spacing out, it may be that what we're attempting was too easy, or it could be that it was too hard given our current skill set. And that, I think, is something to keep really in mind. I find that I've been a guitar player. I grew up playing the piano and singing from about 7 to 15, and then picked up the guitar at 18 and haven't put it down for 25, almost 30 years now. And I find often that it can be really valuable to open up some of those old early learning books about learning a pentatonic scale, for example, and just slowly sort of forgetting that I think I know all there is to know in that book because I've been playing so long, and try to reconnect with that beginner's mind again and refresh some of those skills and find again that sweet spot for how I can lose myself for half hour, hour or more in some enjoyable endeavor like that.
Do you have techniques that you use to try and, or that you use or that you try to teach to try and, I guess, get someone to be mentally calm enough to relax into being right here in the moment?
Yeah, great. Almost yes is the answer, and almost all of them have to do with different components of the breath and different ways to notice the breath. The easiest, or my favorite anyway, is a simple kind of 4-part or square breath, which is as simple as breathing in, holding your breath for a moment, breathing out, and holding your breath out for also the same moment before breathing in again. I tend to do 2 or 3 of those in a row, and it's not necessarily, at least in my experience, powerful enough to move me from a really agitated state to a super grounded state in, say, 2 or 3 of those breaths, but it will always start moving me in the right direction, right? On a scale of 1 to 10 in terms of getting overwhelmed and upset about something, if I'm at a 6 and I do a few of those, it's guaranteed to move me to at least, I'd say, a 5, if not a 4. If I hang with this, right, the lower that'll get. And very often, in the span of a few minutes, right, we can move ourselves, our clients, our fans, right, depending on if we're doing this musically sometimes, right, we have the whole interaction with our audience and the ways that we can kind of play with tension and release and dissonance and so on. But I find so much of it is in terms of learning how to answer your question of relaxing enough, become calm enough, present enough to engage in the learning, to try on some risk-taking with my voice or some of those other things that make us feel so vulnerable, that using the breath, using the body, simple kind of awareness exercises, looking at what you notice now, right? Singing for a bit or getting up and moving around the office and then pausing and closing your eyes, right? And feeling your body and the way that it's vibrating and the ways that it's alive before singing and after. There'll be, different parts of us turn on when we're vibrating like that with sound. And so, most of my centering activities will have to do with kind of bringing attention to our physicality in our body and the breath.
Yeah, really nice, really nice. Cool. Well, the third segment that I have is called Making Sandals. At the end of Josh's book, he shares a really simple but interesting quote. He says, "To walk a thorny road, we may cover its every inch with leather, or we can make sandals."
I love that.
So,
That's
yeah,
really
really
great.
nice. So it's about accepting things the way they are, and not trying to change the world around us, but to maybe change our perspective on things. Again, in your book, you talk a lot about not trying to make your voice like this person or this person, but to try and figure out what your own voice is. So,
Mm.
how do you guide someone to that, or how do you view how to see the world? I guess like what their version of the world can be, and not what they think it has to be,
Hmm.
if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it does. It's a really, really good question. And I think so many of these things, I mean, that quote about the leather and covering the road or make my own sandals is so applicable to almost any of us throughout our lives, right? We spend so much time trying to cover the
Yeah.
road, right? And making our neighbor do this and be this way and control it externally as opposed to working with what I've got internally. And
Yeah.
so I think you're right on, right? That so much of the magic and the beauty of music and singing in particular has to do with our uniqueness, and that no two voices are the same. And the same could be said for, say, guitar players or violin players. We're all going to attack the instrument a little differently. And what I find, it's easier to think about instrumentally for a moment. When I was learning to play guitar and learning how to play some of my favorite songs I grew up listening to with Neil Young and John Denver and James Taylor and Paul Simon and some of my favorite songwriters, even when I discovered early on that even when I was, let's say, covering a James Taylor song, it quickly became apparent that I really wasn't playing it the way James Taylor played it. One, because his skill set is just phenomenal and I was beginning, but two, because inherently there was the Jeremy-ness to the way that I was playing it that can't ever really be
Yeah.
removed from the performance. The same certainly can be true vocally. What I remember as a younger singer, I kept trying to purposely sing like the people I was hearing. And at the time when I was in high school, Pearl Jam was just exploding in Seattle, and Eddie Vedder's voice was this really unique vocal expression that none of us had really ever heard before. And so I was kind of starting to try to sing like him, and then it was doing that unconsciously. And it frightened me a little. Like I kind of didn't
Yeah.
know who I was, right? And I had sort of lost myself in the process. And I
Mhm.
think that happens a bit vocally and musically. And I think some of that's okay, right? We are influenced by the things we hear, and the way that I see that person play guitar kind of gets into how I think about fretting the instrument, for example.
Yeah.
But I think in the end, right, what I would come back to a lot is if we really put in the time, if we practice, if we devote ourselves to our craft and to our bodies and to ourselves and to bringing a sense of presence and practice and diligence to what we're doing, especially as singers, but certainly as instrumentalists, we start to discover that these little pieces of our sound and expression that make us unique. And it might at first feel like these are the metaphorical warts that we're trying to get rid of because we think they're not right. This isn't how I hear it being played. And those sometimes end up being our biggest gifts to the sonic world, right? Or the ways that I sing that note or the slur that phrase or however that sort of becomes just part of
Yeah.
the individual creation in that moment. And again, I think in part so much of that comes back to our awareness and intention, right? If I'm going out there to try to sing like so and so, I'm likely already misguided from the get go. If I love that way that person sings and there's sort of the embodiment of that, but through my lens and my channel, and I think we find it if we keep going and keep listening. I think is a big key. I wrote about that
Mm-hmm.
quite a bit in the book. Is
Yeah.
how fundamentally important listening is to music making in general, but certainly singing, and how so many of us, for example, tend to think, oh, we can't sing, I don't sing, I'm not a good singer, I'm tone deaf. And what a lot of that actually comes down to is just learning that we need more ear training to be able to duplicate vocally what I'm hearing auditorily.
Yeah.
And that can happen. I've seen people that thought they were tone deaf learn how to sing a song, and especially if you place it in the right range.
Yeah, definitely.
But it takes time.
There's a really nice quote that I heard from the Neil Gaiman masterclass, actually. He said that your style is the mistakes you make. And I thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah,
that was a cool way of
great.
putting it.
I love it. Yeah, nice. We sure do make a lot of them, right? And I think if we can look at that through that lens, exactly, that's part of my stylistic presentation as opposed to the places I goofed, right? What a different perspective change. There's a lot of wisdom in that.
Yeah, for sure. Well, that's the end of my segments, but I do have the bonus round.
Oh, yes.
The kind of lightning round.
Great.
Which is something that I call questions to make questions. So these are for you to answer, but for people to kind of just think about what their answers would be as well. And it just could be a quick, short answer if you want, or long. It's totally up to you. But the first one is, what is your life's intention?
These are deep questions for quick answers, right? But I think the shortest one has to do with love and loving and promoting things that are love-based and loving and shining a light in the world, whether that's lifting someone up by picking up the thing they dropped, or by turning that into music that might somehow touch some people, or by writing a book that might be of use, or in my therapy world. But I find that so much of kind of what I feel called to do in the world has to do with sort of lightening the burden of living. It's painful enough as it is, and we all find different ways through that. But if there are ways to make that a little easier, usually I find that the power of connection with people is the remedy for most of our ills. I'm trying to stay as open-hearted as possible and make it a little easier on all of us.
Yeah. Well, that kind of leads into the second one, which is, where is your life's attention to try and make that happen?
I think two things immediately come to mind with there. One, in my daughter, right? She just plays such a primary role in my world that I feel very focused on her and how she's doing and what she's doing and what that means and my role in the world and what I'm leaving behind as I get older. But I think the other way that I think to answer that is that I try anyway to strike a balance between staying focused internally as well as externally. And I find that when I get out of balance, it's usually that I've done too much external focus, whether that's worrying about things like money or the house or the jobs or the groceries or the cooking or the cleaning or the dog or all just the stuff of life. And oftentimes I can get hung up in that and lose my sense of how I'm actually doing, right? It's the same sort of rhythm when people say, how are you? And most of us will say, I'm fine, thanks, without even really pausing to kind of go, well, how am I actually? Or if I knew that person really well and were totally honest with that answer, what might it sound like? So I think part of my attention, at least I endeavor to strike a balance between attending to my inner world and my thoughts and my feelings, which of course belie my actions, and my outer world, and trying to keep attention on both of those things.
Yeah, really nice. My last one then is, what do you know for sure?
Wow. Well, what feels true to me, what I know for sure, is that people are fundamentally good, that we are driven towards wholeness and a sense of completion and goodness, that we all, and it's part of the baked-in matrix, seems to be that we all have lived experiences of feeling not those things, right? Feeling broken and less than and jaded and wounded and less than whole and less than perfect. And yet there is this inherent drive in all of us to move through, to be better, to reflect and recharge and be stronger tomorrow and kinder or whatever, that we have this move towards wholeness and goodness. And I think while that feels true, I think sometimes, myself included, we tend not to give the benefit of the doubt to a lot of people. That person that just cut me off in traffic, I tend not to think about them and their move towards wholeness. I just think of what a hurry I'm in, right? And what a jerk they are. Another thing I feel like I know for sure is that breath makes it better, whatever the it is, right? My anxiety, my tension, my sadness, my doubt, my everything. Breath makes every single issue better or more manageable. And what also, as a closing note for me, I tend to be a bit of an optimist. And what also I feel like I know for sure, and this feels funny to say given what's going on in the U.S. here anyway, politically, and just all of the craziness in our news and the world, and is what still feels true for me unshakably, is that everything is going to be okay.
Nice. It's a good way to end it.
Good. Feels true to me.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, that's all I got then.
Great. Thanks, Jordan. This was really fun to do.
Yeah.
All right, that wraps it up for another episode of Stories of Learning. As always, if you enjoyed what you heard, then definitely leave a note on iTunes. That's how more people get to hear the podcast, so anything there helps out a lot. If you have any stories of your own or questions, then feel free to send them to storiesoflearning@gmail.com. And if you're interested in any bonus content, then definitely go to my Patreon. There will be a link in the description. And there's some cool kind of bonus episodes there for people to check out. All right, we'll see you next time.